Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Bedford Citizens Forum on Town Meeting, Making Your Voice Heard. First of all, I want to acknowledge that this webinar is being recorded. Secondly, I want to say that I've received a call from the White House today, and they asked, what time do you think you'll finish? I said, I think we'll probably take about an hour. And they said, okay, then we'll wait. I promise that's the only thing I'm going to say tonight that isn't true. So, town meeting leads me to consider this phenomenon. Every 4 years in November, people come out by the hundreds to vote for president at the John Glenn Middle School. Sometimes they'll wait in line for as long as an hour. And then several months later in March, we might get around 300 voters to participate in annual town meeting. Now, if your trash doesn't get collected, if your kids can't take art and music in schools, if the pavement on your street is falling apart, who are you going to call? The President of the United States? So the point is that we're blessed in this town with a system of grassroots local government that empowers every voter with the opportunity to participate in decisions that directly impact the quality of life every day. This forum is presented to help you feel at home with the process so that you can meaningfully participate in annual town meeting and special town meetings. You'll get your first chance in just 2.5 weeks on May 15th, a Saturday morning, very unusual, but this has been an unusual year. It'll be on the Sabern Field beginning at 9 a.m. And indeed, over the next 11 months, there'll be 2 additional town meetings in November and March of 2022, and we hope those will be in the Buckley Auditorium of Bedford High School. So let's get started. The presiding officer at town meeting is called the moderator. And it's my honor and all of our honor to hear from the town's 2 most recent moderators, Betsy Anderson and Kathy Cordes, to talk about town meeting's origins, philosophy, and structure. I know I learned something new every time I listen to these 2, and I hope you will too. So let me begin the questioning with this one. Is it accurate to call town meeting the purest form of democracy? And is it actually a branch of town government?
Well, I think it probably is accurate to call it the purest form of democracy. I actually looked up the sort of where that came from. And if you look back, that democracy is ruled by the people. It comes from the Greek word, which I don't think I pronounced too well, but demokratia or demokratia, which means people rule. So in our case, because as Mike stated, all of the registered voters of Bedford can vote, the people indeed are ruling, and it is our legislative form of government.
Now, how is town meeting in Bedford scheduled and organized?
Wait a minute, let me go back to that one because we weren't quite finished with that one.
Right.
Sorry, Kathy.
I was on mute, and so it's my turn to add a little to that. It is indeed, that's the answer to the second part of your question. It is indeed a branch of government. It is the legislative branch of government. So we are the representatives of the town. Each person can represent themselves because every voter can attend. So it's one person, one vote. It's representation because there's no taxation without representation. So you get to be your own representative. You get to decide on whether or not you're going to be taxed for services. And that's what happens at town meeting. You also get to make laws, just like legislators do. And unfortunately, in recent years, there's been this tendency of politicians to use a term town hall And when they say town hall, they say, everybody come, you can talk about anything you want. That is not what town meeting is like. Town meeting has a really confined process and an organizational structure that we're about to describe, I think. So
That's a great lead in. So let's talk about how do we know when to have it and how is it structured? How is the agenda established?
Well, maybe I could just step back a little bit. It's also town meeting is our form of government by our charter. We did look back. The first town meeting in Bedford was held on October 6, 1729, at which point they were just beginning to make decisions about who only the white men could vote, but who would be their leaders and what taxes they would have, how they would provide schools, and actually how they would have a minister for the church, which is something we certainly don't do today. Our charter, which was adopted in 1974, provides for a select board open town meeting form of government. And the select board is the executive branch and town meeting, as Kathy stated, is the legislative branch. And in the charter, it says it will be on the fourth Monday in March. With the pandemic, it has been postponed last year and this year to later, but that's how we know when it's going to be.
And how do we know what we're going to talk about?
well, that's the agenda for the meeting. The agenda in this case is also called the warrant. It is established by the select board. It's mailed to every household and it's posted on the website. Everybody gets a copy of it. And the warrant is called that because it warns you, it lets you know what's going to be discussed at the meeting. It's a description of all the articles that will be presented for town meeting. Each article has to have enough information so that voters are forewarned about the scope of what is going to be presented. And there is every discussion, every comment, every question, everybody who gets up to a microphone to speak speaks directly to whatever the matter is in that warrant article. Warrant articles are proposed by boards like the select board, the school committee, the planning board, zoning articles, Board of Health sometimes has an article on there. Library has had articles on there in the past. And the finance committee that proposes the budget, the actual budget that describes all of the dollars that are being asked for asked of the town meeting to vote for, that will provide the money that the town needs to run.
If an article on the warrant is not proposed by a town board, is there another option for citizens to place something there themselves and independent of going through government?
Our charter also includes the fact that citizens can put in petitions to have articles on the warrant. It takes 10 signatures of registered voters for the annual town meeting and 100 for a special town meeting. And we do have also established in the charter, a petitioners advisory committee, which is appointed by the moderator. And that group will help people in terms of the form of the article, whether they have a fairly good understanding of how our bylaws work, how our town works. And if something just won't work, they will tell them that. They do not get involved at all, however, in the subject matter of the petition.
So I have one final topic for our moderators. And let's put ourselves in the shoes of the voters. Would you say that voters have any special responsibilities in coming to town meeting and participating? And is there a way you'd suggest that they come prepared?
I think Betsy and I can probably make long lists for you of ways to come prepared. But primary on the list is to read the warrant, to read through the warrant reports at the very beginning, read the articles. If there are things that you don't understand in there and you have questions about, write those down on a piece of paper. Look in the back of the warrant, because in the back of the warrant, it describes the rules of procedure, and things that you can do, how to make a motion, how to amend an article, if that's something you want to do. Those are included in the back of the warrant. We also include civil discourse guidelines, because we have a reputation in Bedford for having one of the most civil, polite town meetings in the state. We do have a state reputation about that. And then if you do want to speak, if you are moved by an article that you've read and you want to speak, even if you've never spoken before, it really is easy. You stand at the microphone, you give your name and address, you think about what you want to say ahead of time, and then, because you only have 2 minutes, the rules that we're using right now in our abbreviated town meetings are 2 minutes to make your statement. In that 2-minute time, you can ask a question, you can wait for the answer, and then you can follow it up with a statement, or you can make a statement for or against an article. Betsy, what are you going to add?
I just want to add that this year, because we're going to be outside, there are not going to, if you've been to a town meeting in the auditorium, there are always presentations. Those will not be made at town meeting. They're being made ahead of time by some of the members of this panel and others, and will all be posted to the town's website. I don't believe they're on there yet, but if you look at the Town of Bedford website in the town meeting section, you'll see the warrant is there. There are some of the reports from, I know, from Capital Expenditure Committee, and others will be added. The other thing is it's going to be outside, and you need to be prepared for that. You need to make sure that you have a hat or a raincoat or whatever, you know, the weather appears to be. Bring some water, bring some snacks. Don't leave your trash behind, but all of that is important. Bug spray, etc. And that's unusual, but we don't want people to have to leave because it's too hot, too cold. And the other thing is, just please bring your warrant booklet with you. You will be given a copy of all of the motions. They'll be handed out right at the beginning as you come in.
Can I say one other thing, Mike, about this town meeting? It's going to be a little different. And I know that not everybody who's watching this show probably knows that I'm not there, but I'm not. I am no longer the moderator. I have resigned my position because I'm now in Pennsylvania. And they just wouldn't let me come back and do it if I wasn't living in the town. But so what will happen is in a lot of cases when there's an open seat in one of the boards or committees, the selectmen appoint somebody, or the boards get together and appoint jointly. In this case, the only people who can appoint the leader of the town meeting is the town meeting itself. And so at the very beginning of this meeting, the town clerk will preside, and she will accept nominations. And my understanding is that Betsy Anderson has agreed to have her name placed in nomination. But then there will be an election right then and there, a vote taken, and the person who is elected to moderate will become the moderator.
Let's hope there's no 11th hour mysteries with that. I want to thank both of you so much for adding your wisdom and insight to these issues, because you really created a nice foundation. Before I introduce our next guest, just want to remind everybody that if you happen to have questions, use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and there's somebody there who's monitoring that. The questions will be answered when all the speakers are finished. So turning to the chair of the select board, Margot Fleischman, who's recently was elected to her 4th term. Prior to that, she was on this planning board for 2 terms, which began when she was in the 6th grade. And but she is just really one of the most experienced and enthusiastic leaders that we have and that any town has. Margot, can you go into some, not excruciating detail, but some detail about the process for assembling the warrant? What does the select board and town staff do to prepare for something as major as town meeting.
Well, thank you, Mike. Those are really nice things that you said about me. I appreciate that. I am enthusiastic and I love town meeting. I think one of the first letters to the editor I ever wrote before I was involved in town government was an appreciation for open town meeting. I had never experienced it before I came to Bedford, and it really is something that is precious and special to our community, that anyone can participate and there are no barriers to entry. So in terms of assembling the warrant, it is a huge collaboration between the volunteer citizen members of our town boards and committees and our professional town staff. And it takes many, many, many hours of work to do. And also it starts a lot earlier than people may realize. In fact, this particular town meeting warrant probably started when we made the decision last year during the height of the pandemic to indefinitely postpone the majority of the business that we were going to take up at annual town meeting in 2020. There was a lot of uncertainty coming from the state about how town meeting would be able to happen. In communities that had open town meeting, we couldn't meet inside, we couldn't do it virtually, we had to find a way. And thanks to the hard work of the town staff and Kathy, our moderator, and our facilities department, we came up with a way to have town meeting, but we had it in July and we knew that there was a possibility that it could be very hot. And we needed to get the most essential work of the town done, pass the budget, pass the things that we absolutely had to pass. And so we delayed a lot of business. And so we knew that was coming this year. And so that became the basis of this year's warrant. All of the work that we put in last year kind of just got passed forward into this year. But we went through the same process this year that we do every year, which is that every board and committee works to develop the articles that they're responsible for, as you mentioned. And it's not just the select board, it's not just the finance committee. Charter and bylaw review committee had changes, housekeeping and substantial changes to our bylaws to propose. Capital Expenditures Committee has a whole schedule of meetings where they put together the capital plan and make their proposals and recommendations to the select board about the capital investments that are going to come to town meeting. Community Preservation Committee has a schedule of meetings where they hear proposals and they have a public hearing and they make recommendations about their budget. FinCom, obviously, you'll hear from shortly about how their process about setting guidelines that they give to the town and to the schools to come up with the budget. Planning Board is responsible for the zoning bylaw amendments. And this year, the Council on Aging did some research about the possibility of having a senior and disabled resident tax relief fund. And they did their homework and they talked about it. And then they brought it to the select board. And then obviously you're going to hear later from petitioners who came to the select board with an idea for an article that we wound up adopting. So when all of this work is done, and the articles are ready to go, the town manager is actually responsible. She and her staff is responsible for assembling the articles into a draft warrant. And then over the course of a couple of months, the town staff and the select board review every article in that draft warrant and finalize the language, make sure that we're satisfied with it. Town council is satisfied with it. And along the way, the select board and other boards make recommendations to town meeting. Because as Kathy said, we're not the deciders. We put this information forward and town meeting is responsible for deciding, but we do make recommendations. So we take votes, and for the most part, you'll see in your printed warrant that there'll be a recommendation from the select board and a recommendation from the finance committee as to whether or not that board feels as though that article deserves a positive vote of town meeting. So once all of that is done, the select board votes to finalize the warrant and approve the final warrant, and then it goes to the printer. And then it will arrive in hard copy in everybody's mailboxes. And you'll have that opportunity, as Kathy said, to familiarize yourself with all of the information that's in it. So it's a multi-month process. And in some cases, some of the larger projects that'll be coming to town meeting have been in development literally for years. So if anybody thinks this is just sort of spur of the moment, absolutely not. Lots and lots of work goes into it.
Yeah, for example, the capital plan has always extended by 6 years, right?
That's correct. And also the Community Preservation Committee also has a 6-year plan. And so there could be things that come up and are added more spontaneously or, not on the plan if something, if some capital need were to present itself. But a lot of it is being programmed in advance so that we have stability and predictability about how much we're going to be asked to spend on our capital projects.
I just want to add that if you can't wait for the mail, the warrant is now uploaded on the town website. And it's easy to access and to read. Margot, just one other question. Besides the logistical issues about being on a synthetic field, were there any other special challenges that you had to deal with for a Saturday morning town meeting? And were there any advantages to being pushed back almost 2 months in the process?
The a little bit of extra time probably didn't make all that much difference, but it did allow us a little bit more of a breathing room than we normally get. Sometimes it's quite hectic coming up to the end. I think the biggest challenge for this town meeting is probably just the length of the warrant. And I think that's primarily a function of the fact that we had so much outstanding business from last year that we felt was important to incorporate this year and get caught up. So we do, we appreciate that it's going to be a long day, and we appreciate the help of the moderator and her, the folks who will be helping her make sure that we work through the warrant in as efficient a manner possible while we give people the opportunity to ask questions and to make comments, as we always do.
Thanks for all of your hard work with this. And it's really maybe an interesting outcome. We may stick with the weekend town meeting if it works out.
Well, I think we've been, I think there's pluses and minuses to doing it, all the different ways that you could do it. But we were certainly very pleased last year at the very robust turnout that we had, despite the fact that we were in the middle of a global pandemic. So, I think we are always happy to see robust turnout at our town meetings.
Before I introduce the next segment, I have to, as the old guy here, I have to share memories of town meeting in the past. We used to have a quorum of 150 voters. It's now 100. And any evening when the quorum was short, the way to let the town know we were short was to blow the volunteer fire alarm, which many of you probably have never experienced, but built into the fire station was a very loud, insistent horn to call the volunteer firefighters that we used to have backing up our professionals, even into the 1980s. And when you heard that signal, it meant you better get over to the high school because we need you. I don't know if it ever worked, but it sure made people feel guilty for not going. I think that horn's been disabled. They used to blow it every day at 12 o'clock just to test it. When I had guests from out of town, I'd always find an excuse to be walking by the fire station at 12 o'clock just to see what they do. So the Finance Committee is special. The Finance Committee is almost autonomous. They're appointed in a different way than other committees, and they have a unique role. The 9 of them scrutinize all expenditures, and I mean, with a microscope. And I remember somebody saying to me, the Finance Committee is really tough. And I said, that's what you want. You want a Finance Committee that just says, oh, that looks pretty good, send it along. You want that the elected and appointed officials to sweat a little bit under the Finance Committee's review and make sure they can justify expenses. But I'll leave the details up to the chair and vice chair of this year's committee, both veteran members of the committee, Steve Carluccio and Elizabeth McClung. Thank you so much for being here. Can you just describe what the committee's role is in putting the budget items and other financial items together for the warrant, and what process do you follow?
Okay, yeah. So the role, the Finance Committee is, as Mike said, we're established both by the bylaw and then we're by state statute. I'm not sure if it's accurate to say we're part of the legislative branch. It may be, but we at least report to and inform the legislative branch of town government. We're a 9-member committee. We're appointed, but we're not appointed by, we're appointed by a special appointing committee of 3 people, and you have to be unanimous to get an appointment. It's the chair of the finance committee, the chair of the select board, and the town moderator. There's 9 people on the committee. There's 3 are up per year. So it's a rotating 3. So any one year, 3 are up. And that's the structure of the committee. Elizabeth's going to go into the responsibilities, and then both of us will talk about the process, which goes throughout the entire year, starting with after town meeting up until the next special town meeting and then the annual town meeting. So Elizabeth, you can.
Great. Yeah. So as said before, the Finance Committee is responsible for developing the town's budget. And we spend a lot of time looking in detail at the anticipated income, expenditures of the town and the needs of the different pieces of the town. And we give advice and recommendations in terms of the appropriations that the town is requesting. Then at annual town meeting, the budget that we've created, we present to all, we explain it, and we have a report that we present in the warrant. And if for some reason there's adjustments to the budget that need to be made, then we can have that taken care of at the special town meeting in the fall. Part of what we do, though, also is that we manage what's called the reserve fund, which is a special fund that can be accessed by the Finance Committee to pay bills that may come up for unexpected costs that otherwise we would have to wait for a town meeting for approval for. And recently there have been some costs that we weren't sure what COVID was going to be doing to the town in terms of unexpected costs. So the last couple of years, we've had our reserve fund balance budgeted a little bit higher than what we might otherwise have it at. So the idea is that we've anticipated for this coming year that there are going to be known unknowns, if you will. So things are a little bit different in the schools, for example, and for the needs of the town to address the issues with COVID. And we just want to make sure that we're prepared and we can handle any unexpected costs that come to us. So we have a larger reserve fund this year, and that way we can access and budget items without waiting for the town meeting, but we have to have the Finance Committee approval for that. In terms of the process, if we started at an annual town meeting, usually right after that meeting occurs, we meet to discuss the process and share notes and make suggestions about our process for the year. We just have a little review about that and just discuss the budgeting process and see if we wanted to do anything differently in the coming year. Sometimes there are reserve fund expenditures that we have to approve at the end of the fiscal year in June, and then July is pretty slow, generally speaking, unless there's some unexpected crisis, but that's not often the case. But then what we'll do is if there's any business that comes up that we need to address on behalf of the town, or if we need to make adjustments to the budget, then we do so at the special town meeting in the fall. Steve?
Yeah. So and so from the special, we start meeting again sometimes in August in earnest, and then in the fall in September we start meeting. I wouldn't say every week, but every other week, or sometimes we have a break. But we're mainly preparing for the special town meeting in September. But we start thinking about the budget for the next year too at the same time. Once special town meeting is over, which in a traditional year would be early November, we start working in earnest on what we call a model, which is basically a budgeting tool. It's basically a budget. We call it the model. It's a spreadsheet that's very complicated, as far as maintaining it, but it's the budget, and we start working on that. We do a preliminary budget that we try to get done around Thanksgiving and issue to all the town departments and the schools so that they can do, they can really dive into their work. And we use that, we call that, we issue a guideline. The preliminary budget results in a guideline, which is usually some amount of money above what we spent the previous year. The guideline is used by all the town departments and the schools to develop their budgets along with what their needs are and what's going on in the town and the world. Once that occurs, that process usually runs through December, and then the different town departments are creating their budgets. Once we get to the new year, the different town departments and staff come in and talk to us about their budget, what they may need above the guideline, special situations that are going on. Obviously, there's been a lot of that this year, especially with the schools, but also on the select board side. So that process goes on. There's discussions. It's usually a very collegial, and we're a consensus-driven town and committee. We generally usually agree on the situation and come to, we kind of have consensus amongst all of the groups in an average year over, my experience of over a decade on the finance committee. That results in the final budget that goes into the warrant. The one thing during this process that about FinCom that's unique is that although the select board have lots of responsibilities for town, and the school department has obviously lots of responsibilities, and the largest amount of money that we spend on budgeting is on the school side. FinCom is the one group that sees everything, and we see capital, and then we see the smaller budgets from the smaller elected boards, health, library, the assessors board, and so on and so forth. So once we get to that, then we have the warrant, we vote on the budget. Now what our vote is what our votes are both on the budget and every town warrant article is we're just giving a recommendation to town meeting, the legislative branch of government, as to what we think of either a warrant article or, more importantly, the budget. There's generally 4 articles that are known as FinCom articles in the warrant, which is the budget. We have an ambulance enterprise budget that is also our article. The reserve, not the reserve fund, the stabilization fund, what we're doing with that, and free cash. So those are the articles that we present at town meeting, and they're very intricate to how the budget is created. Part of the process that's developed in the last few years also is we also give our rationales beforehand. We publish that in the different papers in the Bedford Citizen, so that people can kind of see our thinking before they get to town meeting. That would help you prepare questions or things you might want to ask us based on what we've decided. As far as one question that Mike asked on the extra time this year, I will say from the budgeting process and kind of knowing what's going on, at least this year, the extra time I think was helpful, especially to the schools. It kind of helped the schools have a better sense of what they're going to be facing in next year's budget in 2022. So from that sense, this year, I think the extra time was very helpful. Elizabeth, I don't know if you have anything to add, but that's.
Oh, I agree. I think that's true that the extra time this year was good. I'm very curious to see where we go with the date for the town meeting. It's an interesting thing that there were so many people and it was so well organized last spring. And I'm hoping that we have a great turnout again this year. Mike, you're muted.
Can't believe you had to tell me. I want to thank both of you very much. And before I turn to our final scheduled speakers, I just want to mention something that is often misunderstood, and that's a law called Proposition 2.5, which I guess is about 40 years old now. But in summary, it limits your expenditure increase every year overall by no more than 2.5%, exempting new growth that might generate additional revenue. That doesn't mean that your individual tax bill only goes up 2.5%. Your tax bill could be flat. Your tax bill could go up 5%. It puts a ceiling on the overall expenditure of the municipality. And the reason I wanted to bring it up is because I want to pay credit to the Finance Committee and all the elected and staff members. There is a way to bypass Proposition 2.5, and that's called an override. If you just need to spend more money, then it has to be passed by town meeting, and in certain cases, it also has to be passed by a regular ballot. It has to be passed by a supermajority at town meeting. In 40 years, Bedford's never even attempted an override because the finances in the town are managed so well. If you look at the histories of many towns around here, the override is like an annual event. Now, we've had a couple of what they call debt exclusion overrides, which excludes major projects from the 2.5% increase. I think we did one for the high school renovations. But as far as a general override, it's just not in our vocabulary, and everybody should be acknowledged for being for holding fast to that and proving that it can be done. So we wanted to include on the agenda an article that didn't emanate from government, but that went through the government channels. And I'm going to ask Ann Karen and Heather Lavelle to describe, first of all, what is your proposal that will be on the warrant?
Yeah, my name is Heather Lavelle. I'm one of the co-founders of the group in Bedford called Indigenous Peoples Day Bedford. We're working on its warrant article number 34. It's called Indigenous Peoples Day Recognition. And Anne and I approached, as citizens of the town, approached the select board about including this article in this year's town meeting warrant. And the article would designate the second Monday of October as Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day. The change would be observed only in Bedford. Columbus Day would remain a state and federal holiday. And this is just a trend at the local level to rename the holiday. So this past year, maybe the past 7 or 8 months, Melrose, Arlington, Wellesley, Newton, and Maynard have all made this change, and there are many more towns currently working on this. And the language of the article basically just describes the history of Columbus, the Indigenous peoples who were and continue to be affected by the history, and the reasons for celebrating Indigenous people instead of Columbus. And you can read the article on our website, and we can maybe leave it in the chat if that's okay, or you can look it up on the town meeting section of Bedford Town's website.
Now,
Go ahead.
Did you plan to do this through the petition route at first, or did you start with the school committee?
Oh, yes, that I will leave that to Anne. She's going to describe that in a second.
Yeah, so we actually, when Heather and I first met, we first met over Zoom. We never actually have met in person. And it was August and September, and we noticed the school calendar had listed Columbus Day as the holiday in October. And Heather's been engaged in this kind of work in her former town of Melrose. So she and I connected over this and decided to try and go to the school committee to have the holiday changed on the school calendar was our original intent. And school committee encouraged us to make this a town-wide effort. So that's where we thought we could go to the select board. Bopa Malone was instrumental in kind of connecting the dots for us. Like, how would we even do this? Because Heather and I had never done this before. So we needed a lot of advisors to kind of help us shepherd us through the process. So Bopa was kind of our first connection through her Bopa Connect, her monthly Connect meetings that she did here in Bedford. And so that kind of got the ball rolling, and we were invited to present to the select board in January our proposal. And the select board received that very favorably and voted that night to approve including a warrant article on this year's town meeting warrant. And so then it was a question of figuring out the language, and Heather wanted to talk a little bit more about how we came up with the language and the people who helped us through that part of the process.
So for the language, we worked with select board member Emily Mitchell and the founder of Indigenous Peoples Day Massachusetts. Her name is Matoi Monroe. Indigenous Peoples Day Massachusetts is the Indigenous-led group that's been working on local and statewide efforts to rename the holiday. And it was important to include our Indigenous advisors in the writing of the article because it has to appropriately center the perspectives of the people who the holiday is honoring. And that's a big part of what Indigenous Peoples Day Massachusetts does. They work with cities and towns that are developing their articles or resolutions and proclamations to change this name. And the language in the Bedford article is similar to the language that other municipalities have adopted when making this change.
So once the article was accepted by the select board and you were confident that it would appear on the warrant and be decided at town meeting, did you just like sit back and congratulate yourselves, or was there more work to do?
Well, yeah, hardly. So that was just the first hurdle. So getting it on the town meeting warrant was the first hurdle. And we're just very thankful that the select board was very quickly in support of this. And it just made our job a lot easier because we were already able to have that on the warrant. So the next step was basically to get out the vote and to communicate the intent of the article to the larger town community. So Heather and I have started by creating a small coalition of Bedford citizens, completely a volunteer grassroots organization. And so we set up a social media presence on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And we also created a website and are also part of the Indigenous Peoples Day Massachusetts website. So we're able to continue to partner with them. And then we've been talking a lot to a lot of the organizations in town and getting their support and educating a lot of town citizens about what this article is and why it's important to vote favorably at town meetings. So it takes a lot of people to get something like this passed. So it's not just a question of getting it on the warrant. The ultimate goal is to have it pass and to have the citizens vote for it favorably at town meeting. So it does take a large group, and we're very fortunate that Bedford has a long history of community members volunteering to get things done, and this has been a prime example of just that.
Thank you so much for going into that detail, because I think it really is a template for a lot of different things that people might want to do. So now we've finished the formal part, the formal segments, and I want to invite one of the board members of the Bedford Citizen, Lalith Ranganath, who will share any of the questions that came in during the discussion. And I think that the panelists can figure out who the best person to answer them would be.
Yeah, I think for some of them, I can try to direct them to the right person. So I guess on behalf of the citizen and everyone who attended, thank you all for making the time. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure all our attendees did as well. We did have a few questions come in. The first question for Margot, when did the warrant actually sent out? When did it come in the mail?
So we anticipate that the warrant should be arriving in people's mailboxes next week. That was the intention. I know the mails have been slow, so we printed it and had it sent out with the assumption that it would be hitting people's mailboxes early next week. In the meantime, the entire text of the entire warrant is on the town's website.
Perfect, thank you. And I think we put the link in the chat for anyone who wants it. The next question, I think for our moderators, Betsy and Kathy, this might be a good question for you. I'm just going to read it verbatim. It came in saying, I love town meeting in its pre-2020 format. Long may it continue. However, I feel that it excludes full participation of parents with young children. Can we add a Zoom component? I would hate to see everyone staying home rather than a spirited in-person debate, but at the same time, it is a big time commitment. Any thoughts on that question?
So, yeah, it's a conundrum is what it is. There is a Massachusetts Moderators Association that is representative of, that has membership of moderators from all the towns. And there are two kinds of town meeting. One town meeting is our town meeting, which is an open town meeting. And then there's representative town meeting. Representative town meeting is more like the legislator that you're used to thinking about, and that is neighborhoods, literally neighborhoods, elect a representative for the neighborhood, and that person attends town meeting. So in the case of a representative town meeting, you have a finite body of people that are eligible to come to town meeting. You can only come to town meeting if you were elected as a representative. In Bedford's case, we have 9,000 voters. All of those voters are eligible to come to town meeting. So if we had an open Zoom town meeting, we'd have to have a system in place that would allow people to be qualified, because you have to go, when you go to town meeting, you have to walk up to the desk, you have to give them your name, you're checked off the registry list. And if you're not on the registry list, if you're not a registered voter on the registry list, you don't attend town meeting unless there's special circumstances. But anyway, basically. So you'd have to have a system that allowed that, and you would also have to have a nice, secure way to allow for voting that was legitimate. A Zoom meeting is open to the public, and there's no way to control that. So we have not yet, we do have a committee, the Moderators Committee, that is looking at ways to find alternatives to this. But we do not have a way at the moment that is a good solution. You know, it is legitimate to say that it's difficult to go when you're both working parents and you got little kids and you need to get a babysitter. And, you know, but I was there when I moved into town. I had 2 babies. And so we traded off, my husband and I, and then we actually had my mother move in with us. And when she was there, we both went to town meeting, but we traded off nights. I know what it's like to be in that position. And maybe there are people in town who have a great solution to this. We'd love to hear about it.
I guess on a related note, another person asked, is there the way to vote if they're out of town? Somebody who, you know, wants to vote but is not in town. Is there any sort of absentee voting for town meeting?
There is not. It's pretty much the same thing. You have to be there. I was just going to add that some communities do provide some babysitting, early evening babysitting. We have talked about that, never actually done that. And I don't think, it's not even legal to do. It was made, the representative town meetings were only allowed to do sort of a remote meeting during the pandemic. So but it probably raises a lot of good ideas and questions for the future.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question. It says, if the item I care about is toward the end of town meeting, can I enter a town meeting in the middle?
And the answer is yes. As long as town meeting is in session, you can come to town meeting.
And just, to add a little bit to that, because it is going to be a long meeting, and we were looking at some of the logistics of it today, you could actually leave and come back. We're going to be using voting cards, like the fans sort of that we did last year in a different color. And what was stated was that you would have to leave that behind, and then I think you'd have to check back in, but you in fact can do that. Especially people with children, that might have to happen.
And then our last question is for a finance committee, Steve and Elizabeth. One person asked, what is the role of the finance director versus the finance committee?
So I will, this has probably evolved over the years. I'll give you what it's been like since for the last decade or a little longer than a decade I've been on it. The finance director, well, the finance director has is a job, a big job in town. There's lots of employees. There's lots of financial work to do. Once the budget is done for a year, then you got to implement. So their biggest job is implementing and taking care of all of the things that go into a finance director. But as far as what they do working with the finance committee, during my experience over the last decade, they've basically been our point person with town staff to help us get the information we need and weed through all the things, help us schedule people that are coming to talk to us. So we work really closely with the finance director every step of the way. The model that we talked about was actually, I think, developed by 2 finance directors ago, and then very, very well and professionally maintained by the last finance director. And when we get the new finance director coming on board, we hope it continues that way. So it's a very close working relationship in the budgeting process with the finance director, but they obviously have a much bigger job. And there's actually 2 finance directors in town. There's a finance director at the school side too. So the town really has 2 finance directors working simultaneously. But we work much more closely with the town side, the select board side finance director than the school side, but we communicate with the school finance director and the school superintendent also in our process.
Great, thank you. That was very helpful. Just one more note that there's more information in the chat. We put the presentations link as well in there. So, we can all have our homework to do before town meeting. Again, I want to thank everyone on behalf of the citizen. I'll turn it over to Mike to say some final words of wisdom.
Yeah, it's a little early, so we'll have time for one more quick story. The question was, can you come to a town meeting whenever you want? And so naturally, the other question is, can you leave whenever you want? Well, normally you can, but I was at a town meeting where you couldn't. And here's what happened. We were very close to the end. It was very late. It was probably 11 o'clock on the second night of town meeting, and we were close to the finish. But somebody wanted to challenge the quorum. And so we had to count all the people in the room, and it was exactly 150. If one person would leave, we knew we had to stop. Everybody knew that. So the moderator, His Honor, retired Judge Robert A. Barton, put one police officer at one door and one police officer in front of the other door and said, nobody can leave until we finish the warrant. Obviously, this is the United States. You don't have to, the police can't make you stay at town meeting. Nobody challenged them. Poor lady in the front saying, but have to go to the bathroom. But that wouldn't have helped either. It's the only time I've ever seen people decide, I think it would be a good idea to stay. And we finished. He is a legendary character in the annals of Massachusetts. 90 years old, still lives on Page Road, and he has a million stories. Sorry to take a little bit longer than you thought, but I wanted to leave you with a little folklore. Thanks again to all of the panelists. Your information and advice are invaluable and inspirational. We hope that we have some new converts that tuned in tonight, and we look forward to additional community forums sponsored by the citizen throughout the spring and summer. Be on the lookout for details on those. So thank you again for all of your support and participation, and have a good night.
Thanks, Mike.